Yeah, Proverbs 24:21, my son, fear the Lord and the king, and do not join with those who do otherwise. For disaster from them will rise suddenly, and who knows the ruin that will come from them both. Specific wisdom here from Solomon to his son: do not join with those who do otherwise. There are people who don't fear the Lord and don't fear the king properly, who don't have a proper respect for authority. And there's always a movement. There's always some rebellious movement. Human beings are innately rebellious, many of us anyway. And so there's always this kind of back pressure, but there's always, you'd say there's always a rebellion fermenting beneath the surface. Don't join with those people. Do not join the revolution, would be Christian. I mean, you don't need that. 1 Peter 2 verse 13, be subject. Romans 13, submit yourselves. It's very simple. I don't think you can marry that with rebellion, even against an oppressive state. And the clincher for that is the reality that this was addressed to people under Nero.
Right.
It's not difficult. You're going to say, oh, yes, but they were under the thumb of the Roman government. There was no opportunity for them to rebel, so it wasn't given to them to rebel. Well, that would be hard because you've got the teaching of the whole New Testament. You've got the example of Jesus. Jesus who himself, Jesus was the king of Israel. The people wanted to make him king. And yet he wouldn't let them. And when he could have called upon 12 legions of angels, he didn't. And when Peter drew a sword, he said, put away your sword. I mean, he then spent 40 days teaching them about the kingdom. And Peter, James, and all the rest of them didn't raise an army.
Yeah.
They didn't start the revolution.
Right.
None of their teachings contain teachings about the revolution. In fact, their teachings and their example lead us to this pattern of evangelistic submission.
All right, Tom. Well, it's time for the third episode.
Okay.
Maybe the final episode. We'll see, at least for today. We've been working through the BASiS series from 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. We've been applying the principles you gave us to all sorts of situations. We sort of started from silly and been slowly escalating the situations from more and more and more intrusive issues, more and more potentially violating our consciences, looking at it from different perspectives. And I think for this third episode, we just need to finally kind of tip over into, this isn't the case for us now, but how do Christians who are living under a regime which we would say is tyrannical or is persecutory, is fundamentally persecuting Christians, committed to persecuting Christians, how do we start to apply these principles when we don't have the freedoms that we're used to in the West, that we've grown accustomed to in the West? Does that change things? How does it change things? There's plenty of Christians who have lived throughout these kinds of regimes, both now, presently, and in church history. So I think we have the benefit of thinking about a lot of these things from a default position of having way more freedoms than most Christians historically have ever had, which makes this more hypothetical than it probably has been for most of church history in a lot of ways. So how do we start to think about, okay, we are Christians now living in under rulers, a government authority, which is fundamentally opposed to the Christian faith and is not just disinterested or disapproving, but actively trying to shut down or counteract what we teach and believe and hope as Christians. So I guess to start, would you say is there a fundamental difference when we go from having rights enshrined in the government that we can exercise to not having those rights anymore as Christians?
Well, Paul wasn't embarrassed to employ the rights he had as a Roman citizen. for the sake of those in the church, it seems in Acts chapter 16, Philippi, he's willing to say, you would say, stand on his rights and make the magistrates come and escort them out of prison. You say, why did he do that? Well, it seems as though he was setting some ground rules to alleviate some of the potential for persecution based upon the precedent that he painfully experienced himself in so many places where the Christians were just terribly persecuted. But here was an opportunity. He wasn't afraid to say, no, you've treated us wrongly. Now let's try to establish some, you would say, legal precedent for you not to persecute these Christians. On other occasions, when it was him personally that was suffering, maybe he didn't have the opportunity, but there's no evidence that he called upon his own rights in other situations. And so you just left with the impression, at least in the New Testament, that he was willing to, you would say, fight for rights, for the protection of others. But Paul and others were willing to endure any persecution, any suffering for the sake of the gospel. And again, you would say, for whom? Well, for the sake of the people that they were witnessing to, like Stephen, bearing testimony even whilst he was martyred. So many of them in the end giving their lives. So I think that sets the background. I think the background also is just the reality that the expectation was in those days that the expectation that Jesus set in the world, you will have tribulation. That we're to expect it. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. It's not going to be different for the master and the pupils, as it were. We're following Christ. We expect to take up our cross and follow him. So we should expect persecution. We shouldn't expect a bed of roses. We shouldn't expect the government, which is effectively dominated by the God of this world. We shouldn't expect the government to be somehow on the side of Christianity. So I think that's the background. Certainly in the New Testament era, the Christians to whom this was written, Peter was writing to Christians for whom there was no expectation of right. Every expectation of a fiery trial coming upon them, chapter 4, verse 12. And Peter's preparing them for that in a government setting where they couldn't expect any favorable treatment, and he's just saying to them, submit to authority. So and I just think there's no get out of jail free card for us when it comes to that. And we tend, having come from a Christianized background, where particularly in Britain, with a history of church and state being mixed up together, we've expectations that somehow the government, the king, the government should be somehow defending the faith. That's never been the expectation in the New Testament.
That's helpful. So let's say we find ourselves in this regime, which in our case is hypothetical, but not impossible. And for some Christians right now is very much the case. How do we think about modern history, which shows a regular pattern of revolt, revolution, rebellion against this kind of tyrannical government? And you can see, it's interesting, you see even in Jesus's time, the Jews are regularly trying to rebel against Rome or against Greece or whoever their oppressors are. So it's not a fundamentally modern concept to rebel or to revolt. But obviously in the post-Enlightenment era, we have an understanding that that's something that could happen to you if you do this. And it's even, I think, become mixed in with church history and Christian conception of, I actually need to fight for the freedom of my people, and so therefore I can. How do we think about rebelling against authority when authority is sinful, wrong, evil, etc.?
Are we going to do this in English and an American talking about
Hey, we're going to do our
certain
best.
inalienable rights?
Listen.
Inalienable. That's built into your Constitution, isn't it? It's built into the history of America as the decision that the people have a right to rise up and throw off oppressive authority.
Right.
That's a huge question.
It is.
That's a huge question. I can't find that here in 1 Peter chapter 2. I can't find it here in Romans 13. I can't find it in Titus 3. The people that would try to find it in these places end up arguing from Reformation resistance theory. It's an extension of things said by Calvin and others. It's in Calvin's Institutes in a small way, but there are those who argue that Calvin didn't intend for it, didn't mean what people have taken him to mean. Certainly those who followed, certainly Zwingli and others who followed have developed a principle of resistance. Zwingli died in battle, I believe. John Knox was one who took the Reformation resistance principle to the point of, willingness to bear arms. So some of these reformers were willing to say, look, if a tyrannical regime is oppressing its people, then it's the duty of a lesser magistrate, an inferior magistrate, to resist the oppression, the you would say abuse of authority by a superior magistrate. So let's say an emperor wants to send his army to abuse the people who are under your authority. It's kind of an extension of the situation I described to you in the last episode. So someone wants to boss your wife about.
Right.
You've got now your wife is under your headship, but that's also your protection. And if this guy wants to boss your wife about, it's your job to say, take a walk. If this guy wants to abuse your wife or your children, it's your job as their protector, their provider, the man, the head. It's your job to step up and resist, even to the point of self-defense, violence if necessary, to resist that abuse. Nobody would say that was wrong. Now, that's very different from revenge. So if someone comes to abuse your family and they carry out an act of violence, you chasing them down the street to beat them over the head with a stick, it is stepping out of your role as a defender, and you're taking on the role of the state. The state bears the sword. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But the state, actually, I wish I brought it with me. William Tyndale does a great piece on this. So, magically, I've got the book now. William Tyndale, in this fantastic book, The Obedience of a Christian Man, he has this section on the obedience of subjects unto kings, princes, and rulers. And he cites Exodus 22. In Exodus 22, in all causes saith he of injury or wrong, whether it be ox, ass, sheep, or vesture, or any lost thing which another challengeth, let the cause of both parties be brought unto the gods. Whom the gods condemn, the same shall pay double unto his neighbour. And he points out, the editor points out that the judges are called gods. Mark, the judges are called gods in the scriptures because they are in God's room and execute the commandments of God. And in another place of the said chapter, Moses chargeth, saying, see that thou rail not on the gods, neither speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Whosoever therefore resisteth them, resisteth God, for they are in the room of God, and they that resist shall receive the damnation. So he's making an argument here that we must submit to the authorities, because the authorities are the ones who must execute judgment. The sword, which he has already dealt with in a previous section here, the sword is also for the punishment of the wrongdoer in terms of appropriate vengeance, you would say. So the authorities are the ones that carry out the vengeance of God upon the wrongdoer for them. A very interesting, excellent obedience of the Christian man. Now, when you run down the street after the person who's just mugged your wife, and you catch him and you beat him over the head with a stick, you are usurping the role of the authorities. And so for us to step up to resist the intrusion of an abusive authority, that's one thing. For us to step up to take the place of an authority is another. That's an act of rebellion. So we're coming back to this question of when is it right to rise up and remove an oppressive authority? Well, the Reformation resistance principle is kind of an extension of this idea that when an oppressive authority, when an abusive authority is harming people who are under your protection, if you're a lesser magistrate and a more senior magistrate wants to come and harm your people, you have a duty to protect them.
Sure.
So you have a duty to resist him, even to the point of raising arms. Now, all that I've just described are functions that happen at a civil level.
Yeah, right.
And that, it can't be stressed enough, that is completely absent in any of this instruction that's given to the church. The reason you can't find it here in 1 Peter 2, one in Titus 3, Romans 13, well, because this is instruction for the church. The instruction for the church again and again is to be submissive. Our mission as a church is not to usurp the function of the state. Huge problems seem to have occurred in church history, and I would say the reformers getting into the Reformation resistance principle, and the church straying into kind of promoting or preaching rebellion against the state, is for the church to stray into the realm of the state. Now, they would argue differently, and it would be very interesting to have this conversation with some people a lot more versed in church history than I am. Maybe we could do that. Maybe I could interview some people. Greg Fraser is a great historian. He's written a book, God Against the Revolution. He's actually on the same page as John MacArthur. I heard John MacArthur once in a address he gave here to British pastors at, I think it was Banner Truth Conference, about 2000. And he told a group full of English pastors that he believed the American Revolution was unwarranted scripturally. I've heard others, like Greg Fraser, articulate the same perspective, that there's no biblical warrant for the church to become involved in agitating for rebellion. And I think it's pretty important for us to state.
So let me clarify that, because I think obviously we are now treading on a revolution which you could say wasn't started by the church but was endorsed by the church. So that could be...
What you're talking about, the American Revolution,
right?
Yeah. So rebellion,
right? Yeah, revolution, rebellion, potato. But what about? Okay, so we're talking about potentially oppressive rulers.
Yeah.
But what about the case of Israel under the time of the judges? They're under oppressive rulers, and God raises up men who rescue them from this oppression. the guys like Ehud, who you would say that's a pretty standard revolutionary kind of narrative. Is that not warranted today? Is the church not allowed to see injustice and to rise up and to make a change in order to bring justice into the nation?
Well, you had a guy in America just the other day strap a knife to his belt and a shotgun on his back and a pistol in his holster, and he legged it into the White House correspondence dinner trying to kill the president. And he would have had as a kind of a motivation for his thinking, I guess, something like the idea of that Ehud had when he strapped a sword to his thigh and went in to the king. Just trying to think of the king's name. Eglon, Moabite king.
I think so.
And put it in so that the hilt of the sword disappeared into his belly. His idea was, okay, it's my personal job to see this leader of an oppressive nation bite the dust. I mean, that was his basic idea, and Ehud's plan succeeded. The war was begun, and the Moabite oppression ceased. What was his name? Thomas Cole Allen, was it? The other day, the chap who ran into the White House representatives' dinner. Well, he failed, and I would say, thank God, he failed. He failed because people stopped him, but he also failed from the start, from a Christian perspective, because look, the Christian idea in the biblical idea, you would say, with Ehud rebelling against Eglon, is that Ehud was an appointed judge, a deliverer for the nation of Israel. He was a representative of the nation of Israel, and he was engaging, I suppose you would say, in an assassination.
So he's a civil.
He's a civil authority. He's a duly appointed civil authority. He's launching an act of war against an oppressive state.
In a theocracy overseen by God.
In a theocracy overseen by God, and you'd say prompted by God. So I don't think the two are comparable.
Yeah.
I don't think the two. I don't think it's ever the case. I mean, in fact, there's Proverbs 24. Proverbs 24. I think it's verse 21. Let's have a look. Yeah, Proverbs 24:21. My son, fear the Lord and the king, and do not join with those who do otherwise. For disaster from them will rise suddenly, and who knows the ruin that will come from them both. Specific wisdom here from Solomon to his son: do not join with those who do otherwise. There are people who don't fear the Lord and don't fear the king properly, who don't have a proper respect for authority. And there's always a movement. There's always some rebellious movement. Human beings are innately rebellious, many of us anyway. And so there's always this kind of back pressure, but there's always, you'd say there's always a rebellion fermenting beneath the surface. Don't join with those people. Do not join the revolution, would be Christian. I mean, you don't need that. 1 Peter 2 verse 13, be subject. Romans 13, submit yourselves. It's very simple. I don't think you can marry that with rebellion, even against an oppressive state. And the clincher for that is the reality that this was addressed to people under Nero.
Right.
It's not difficult. You're going to say, oh yes, but they were under the thumb of the Roman government. There was no opportunity for them to rebel, so it wasn't given to them to rebel. Well, that would be hard because you've got the teaching of the whole New Testament. You've got the example of Jesus. Jesus who himself, Jesus was the king of Israel. The people wanted to make him king. and yet he wouldn't let them. And when he could have called upon 12 legions of angels, he didn't. And when Peter drew a sword, he said, "Put away your sword." I mean, he then spent 40 days teaching them about the kingdom. And Peter, James, and all the rest of them didn't raise an army.
Yeah.
They didn't start the revolution.
Right.
None of their teachings contain teachings about the revolution. In fact, their teachings and their example lead us to this pattern of evangelistic submission. So I don't think you can argue that under a tyrannical, abusive regime, let's say you're a Christian in North Korea and you get the opportunity to assassinate Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, there we go.
Let's say you had that opportunity. Kim Il-sung was his dad, was it? Or whatever. Let's say you got that opportunity. Right. There he is, the man who's at the center of it. Is he your assassination target, or is he your mission field? You got an opportunity. You're face to face with Hitler. Do you tell him the gospel or do you kill him? A lot of people would say you do a lot of good by killing him. Well, you kill him, you send him straight to hell. And a lot of people would say, great, that's good. I don't think they understand hell, and I don't think they understand the value of a single soul. When God had a servant that he was going to bring before the authorities and bring into close contact with the authorities, God wasn't training him to be an assassin. God was training him to be a missionary. That's the book. You will testify before me in Rome, says God. What's he going to do? He's going to go and bear witness to the resurrection. And was it effective? Was Nero saved? No, Nero executed Paul. But some of Nero's household was saved. And so Paul got to share the gospel. Some were saved right at the top of the Roman government. So right there, I think you've got the Christian mission in a nutshell. The church is not, and this is where people get confused with the whole church has replaced Israel, and we're a nation now, and we've got to take over. This is where eschatology really matters, because if you get confused about that stuff, as some people are, they really do want to assassinate Trump. They really do. Their mission is not save Trump. You got the Christians who believe Trump is saved just because he mentions the name Jesus, but then you've got the people who believe that Trump is the devil incarnate, and their mission is to assassinate him for the sake of the church. Well, no, Trump is the mission field, and witnessing to him, well, that's what God would have sent Paul to do.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. It goes against our sensibilities in the West. We love a good rebellion story. I know Americans obviously do, but you've got
plenty of them.
any movie that you can think of where there's a good rebellion, it gets your heart pumping because you're seeing freedom triumph and those kinds of things. And I think that we as Christians have to think a bit more deeply than that.
If we just capture evangelistic submission as our mission, we've got it, really. I mean, and to beware of our hearts, not to use our freedom, but to be willing to stand up to anyone, like the apostles were, like Paul was, and go to the sword, fine. Go to the cross, fine, but don't go with a sword.
So, what about where the government has enshrined or enabled the ability to speak against it freely, right? So we have the gift of free speech here in America and other places in the West in a way that you would say the early church certainly didn't. Many churches in the world don't today. So, there's an element of we don't need to rebel, but we can make our voice known through voting and through the kinds of legal,
for freedom,
those kinds of things. What about the issue of protesting? What about the issue of going on a march against X, Y, or Z government policy. For me, there's an issue there where I get that it's a freedom that's enshrined civilly, but it seems like it's hard to distinguish that from a rebellious spirit. It's hard, as we've been talking throughout about, do you want to be known as a rebel or do you want to be known as fundamentally submissive? And the idea of marching through the streets openly saying, the government's wrong, I disagree, I'm against this. The government allows you to do that, and that's a protected right. But then as Christians, are we kind of really engaging in a sort of legal grumbling kind of thing? You understand my question?
I do. Yeah, I don't think it's I don't think it's sinful to protest. I think you could argue that Paul, when he said, let them come and escort me out from the prison, was engaging in a form of protest. He wasn't just meekly complying with everything. You could argue that was civil disobedience. The magistrates has said, let them go. And he said, we're staying. There's that whatever you're going to call that, it's not Paul blowing whistles and screaming or throwing paint over beautiful paintings in the gallery, gluing himself to something. It's not a stunt.
Sure.
So he's engaging in an action to bring about to bring attention to an issue. I don't think you can obviously speak against that.
Well, obviously he uses those opportunities to do what?
Well, he's using the opportunities to try to. It seems like he's using that opportunity to try to procure freedoms for the people in Philippi, and so I wouldn't be quick to condemn people who at least are trying to achieve the same by peaceful means. That said, it's one incident in the life of the Apostle Paul. Is there anything else? Okay, he at one point he's stretched out and he's about to be flogged, and he says, is it legal to flog a Roman citizen? Is it okay to do that? And they're like, ooh, well, we're overstepping the law here. And so he calls upon his rights. On another occasion, he appeals to Caesar, which was his right as a Roman citizen. So you can see him working within the legal framework that is there and is a protection to him and to others. So I don't think that's wrong. I'm thankful for people that work within that framework. I think what you're pointing out, which is something which always troubles me, is there seems to be a failure on the part of so many Christians who get an opportunity at this point by being persecuted. They get an opportunity to put their hope on display, but instead of that, they adopt what you described as a kind of a whining, complaining attitude. I mean, we're even told do everything without grumbling and complaining.
Right.
So that would also include any protesting that we do.
Right.
There's nothing in Paul's attitude or demeanor in those passages. There's nothing there to suggest that he was kind of shouting and angry or whiny. He's very calm.
Right.
Is it lawful for you to flog a Roman citizen without a trial? That's a question. It's not even, he's not even saying, what are you doing? I'm going to have your heads. Or,
right.
There's a respect. Honor everyone, Peter says here in 1 Peter 2:17. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor.
Well, and just a few verses later, speaking of Jesus's response to being persecuted, right? When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly.
Yeah, we're going to dwell on that in the next section. The next section is going to be how to witness at work, and that example that Peter gives of Jesus's patience and enduring, quietly entrusting himself whilst suffering unjustly. That is going to be what's held in front of us as the demeanor that's the right demeanor. But I think we're missing a trick, because when Jesus says in Matthew 5:12, rejoice when people persecute you. How does it go? Exaliaste. jump for joy. I mean, jump for joy when people persecute you. Why? Because great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I mean, literally, to be believing at that point in time that you have just won the spiritual lottery, as it were, that for the sake of someone else picking on you and giving you unjust treatment, you're going to be rewarded in heaven. I mean, there's no easier way to earn a heavenly reward. I mean, it just happens to you.
Right.
And I mean, if you believe that and you're really pleased, that's if your demeanor at that point is shocking to the world. And again, we're talking about evangelistic suffering then, aren't we? So we're saying we're suffering wrongly, we're enduring sorrow while suffering unjustly, as Peter puts it later. When we do that, it's perplexing to the world. They can't understand it. When we rejoice in the face of suffering, well, that's just shocking. Then people are going to be saying, what's the reason for the hope that's in you? And then we can tell them the gospel. So I just think the people who do engage in that are missing a trick. They're missing an opportunity. And it always saddens me. I mean, the very people that I'm thankful for in the legal profession, I kind of wouldn't want them representing me. I'd want a lawyer representing me who understands this, that it's a great privilege to suffer, if that's, and we don't want, as Christians, to be spending all our time trying to tell the world what a terrible time we've had because of all this terrible treatment. You know, I want to tell the world that, okay, it doesn't matter. I'm a sojourner. I'm passing through. Yeah. So I don't know if I've answered your question. I think it's helpful.
So this just comes to mind as you're talking about this, just as a question I imagine people would ask. What then do we do with Luke 22 when Jesus says, "But now let the one who has a money bag take it and buy a knapsack, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one"?
Yeah, well, they were about to be scattered, and they were about to enter into a time when they would need a sword for self-defense. I think that's the understanding. It certainly wasn't Jesus telling his followers to take up the sword, because that is not picked up in the New Testament anywhere.
Yeah, that's helpful. Okay. So
but on that point, Paul specifically says the weapons of our warfare are not carnal.
Right.
He talks about arguments for the tearing down of strongholds, not siege weapons, but arguments. We destroy arguments, he said.
So the last topic that has come up that we can only touch on, as we'll see here, but we've touched on it briefly, and now we need to sort of hit it head on. The government commands us to do many things. We need to be responding as freemen and as slaves of God. What do we do when the government calls us to war?
Oh boy. Yeah.
I'm raising 4 boys.
Yeah. And I think I said in one of the sermons that actually we need to raise boys. We need to raise men, because societies have always faced war. It's men that do the fighting. And there are always evil nations who are willing to take advantage of weak nations. And for as much as we think we're living in a different era, the human heart hasn't changed. Right. And it would be a miracle of incomprehensible proportion if we didn't face war within another generation.
Yeah.
And that means that, yes, your boys, wow, what a thought. My child most likely will witness war in her lifetime. That's a horrifying thought. But it's a thought that every previous generation has faced as a fact and dealt with as a fact, rather than doing what we're doing, which is just kind of imagining that we won't have to face it again. Well, if the human heart hasn't changed, if evil nations will still just break the rules and break international law as if there was an international police force to enforce it, but they'll just set aside the laws and
Right.
start wars. If that's the case, well, then we have to be mentally prepared for that. I think that means as Christians we have to have a readiness to face the reality of war. That's made me think about it a lot. I've been thinking about it for decades, and I've still got a whole heap of questions. I think one of the things that's got me really concerned post-COVID is the reality that, okay, in a time of war, it is impossible for governments to give all the information to their people.
Right.
So decisions have to be made by government at a government level, at an authorities level, let's say, that ordinary people like you, like me, our children cannot be privy to.
Right.
So if you cannot be privy to all the information, you can't make an evaluation of the decision adequately. Now, I've just said we're to submit as free men, and we're to be slaves of God. Well, submitting as a free man requires you to make an evaluation of the morality, the rightness or wrongness of a command that you're being given. Now, in everyday life, okay, you must do this, says some guy on the street. Well, is that something God would want me to do, or is that not something God would want me to do? Right. But now along comes the government and says, you've got to go fight and kill those people. Well, the situation that requires of citizens in a country at that point is for them to trust the moral authority of the ones making that decision. Now, because every soldier wants to know that they're fighting for a just cause. Right. Either we're fighting because these evil people are going to come and invade us. That's obvious, a defensive war. The just war theory has been well developed by the church down through the millennia, not just the centuries. But a defensive war is a just war. Someone's going to come and invade and kill my people. It's legitimate to engage in a defensive war, says the church down through the millennia. But now we're talking in modern warfare terms, and we're dealing with war on a different continent in order to protect our people back home. You got to trust that there's an extra level of trust required, especially post-Iraq. We're told there's weapons of mass destruction. Well, there were no weapons of mass destruction found, or so the argument goes, and so the government lied to us. Oh boy. Well,
not to mention Vietnam.
That's a massive problem. Vietnam, you got a lot of people going there and discovering that things are not the way they were told back home before they left. It's a huge problem because truth is the currency that buys moral authority. Right. So you're a government. You want your people to trust you that your decision about the morality of this war is trustworthy. Go fight and die for your country because we say, as the people in the know, we say that this is just.
Right.
Well, truth is the currency that can buy that. If that's why I believe it's a tragedy of unparalleled proportions that our government has chosen to lie and lie and lie. Not just this government, but the previous one and the previous one. We've come to realize that the government is willing to lie to us about our freedoms, pandemic conditions. Where does that stop?
Right.
Issues to do with war. Now, you could argue, yes, there's always going to be deception involved in warfare because you can't tell the enemy what you're going to do, etc. Okay, get that. But I think if you go back in time and ask people, do you fundamentally believe that the government is going to tell you the truth about an issue like that in our country, in a country with more of a Christian heritage? you could have said that your average person would trust the government on an issue like that and on an issue like a pandemic, major decisions such as lockdowns and so on. Well, we've come to realize that the government is willing to lie. Now what? Now what? And this is huge because I talked earlier about the conscience. There's nothing so poignant for the question of conscience as a government asking you to kill somebody.
Right.
I've got to go and stand in front of people in a foreign country somewhere, or even operate a drone and just blow people up.
Right.
Because I'm told by the government that they're the bad guys. But then I find out time after time after time that the government's willing to lie to me.
Right.
How do I believe that they're the bad guys now? Right? As truth is the currency of moral authority, and our government has been trading in lies. Well, that's devastating. So that's why I'm burdened to kind of investigate, I suppose you would say, this question. And here's where I'd like to investigate it. I'd like to interview a number of people that I've got in mind. Greg Fraser would be one of them. I think one of our professors, Mike Grisanti, has taught ethics and has an interest in World War history, World War II history particularly. He would be very interesting to interview. I think there's some key individuals that I'd love to interview on this and try to draw out this question of, okay, in the post-COVID world where we have had our trust in government shaken, how do we engage in this issue of submission and authority in wartime conditions? And here's why it's so crucial, because in a wartime condition, in a war situation, once you sign up as a soldier, unless your commanding officer tells you murder these women, murder these children, there's something called the fog of war, which means that once you get into battle, you're just told, shoot this way, shoot these people. You don't have the information. You don't have the details. Maybe you're involved in the Air Force and you're just told bomb these coordinates. So you're not in the position to make moral evaluations most of the time. You just have to be. It's kind of like a slave situation. It's like a situation as a child when you can't explain to your children all the reasons why you're doing something. You just have to say to them, "Trust me, I'm responsible for this. You must do X." Right. A little bit like that in the military. There must be a chain of command. Soldiers have to do what they're told on the battlefield. Right. If without that, authority disintegrates. Right. Warfare is impossible. Armies fail. So governments rightly require a chain of command with complete compliance. Right. When you sign up as a Christian now, you sign up as a Christian, what are you doing? You're handing over yourself as a slave to a master now, and you're saying, all right, I'm just going to do whatever he says. Yeah. Well, that's a great level. That's a high level of trust to do that. To do that voluntarily when you know that the government is lying to you, that's a problem. To do it in a time of war, when you suspect that the government is probably lying to you and you just don't know, well, that raises massive questions for the conscience of a Christian. Can I, in good conscience, go to war and fight these people whilst I'm really thinking that the government is probably lying to me? Yeah. Well, then you've got, but whatever is not of faith is sin. Right. So can I do that? Now the sanctity of the Christian conscience makes me believe that in conditions like that may well drive a lot of Christians to become conscientious objectors. And I'm not someone who is in favor of conscientious objection.
Right.
I'm a guy who's in favor of. I mean, I would say I'm with C.S. Lewis on the. Why I am not a pacifist end of the argument, and I don't believe war is wrong. Jesus didn't tell the soldiers to leave their professions, or John the Baptist didn't, rather. That's the Roman centurions were not told walk away.
Yeah.
It seems like being a soldier is in itself, can I say, a noble, a necessary profession.
Right.
It's like bearing the sword for good reason.
Right.
But when you're doing that under a government that won't tell the truth, one thing I would say is I don't think that's new. I don't think the Romans.
Exactly.
I don't think the Romans had a different basic situation. I don't think they had the option. So there's a lot there to think about. I don't know if you can see that. I'm wrestling with this question of a Christian's conscience at that point, and I think it is an area that really requires a good deal of investigation. I think it would be very helpful to play that out in some interviews. I've got a lot of questions that I'd like to ask some of our friends.
Yeah, no, I think that would be really good. So I guess more to come on that, God willing. So as we wrap this up, you finished talking about conscience, and I think it's important as we've been talking through all sorts of different areas, and one of the things that we're highlighting throughout is the reality that these are principles that each Christian is required to apply to their own situation, understanding their various responsibilities and duties before God and before man in their situation. And so what often happens when we have these kinds of discussions is there's more than one God-glorifying option, depending on how your conscience allows you to settle, right? And you can't sin against your conscience, but your conscience might lead you to do one side or the other side within, obviously, what is still obedience. And I think it'd be important for us to wrap up this discussion to just talk through, as a church, how do we function when we have various convictions, various issues of conscience, and the reality that often we just don't know all of the reasons why a brother or sister might have decided to do what they're doing, right? And so I think it's our flesh prefers for it to just be a binary, this is what we do as Christians, or this is what our church does. We are a this kind of church, or a that kind of church, or a this kind of fellowship group, or that kind of or what have you, right? I'm of Apollos, I'm of Paul. It's easier to just have a team, stick with it, because then I don't have to have my conscience and my convictions potentially. I don't want to rub up against other options. I don't want to have to deal with that. That's potentially threatening, frustrating, etc. So as we think about this, as we start to take these principles and apply them either now or in the future, how do we as a church, as GraceLife London, think about loving each other when we might not all land in the same position with these kinds of things going forward? We certainly didn't, with COVID, all land individually on the same place. And how do we think about this?
I think Romans 14:15 is really helpful. 15, especially the first couple of verses, we who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell upon me, and so on. So the chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, as for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. That's sometimes translated disputable matters. I think, this is talking about Romans 14 and 15 there. The weak are the ones who have qualms about eating meat sacrificed to idols. The strong are those who believe that an idol is nothing. Their conscience is satisfied. They can eat meat sacrificed to idols without defiling their conscience. And there's these weak people, and temptation on the part of those who are strong. They've got these things sorted out in their minds, the different categories, and idols, nothing, only God, and meat sacrificed to idols is nothing. And yes, I know it says you mustn't eat that under the old covenant, but that's okay because Jesus said eat everything. And they've got it all sorted out in their minds. It's just like, oh, we've got this. The temptation for those people who are strong is to look down upon those who are weak. And Paul says, accept the one who is weak, but not to quarrel about opinions or disputable matters. Look, in the church, we are to have peace. Honor everyone. Well, that includes the weak person, includes the civil magistrate, includes Nero, includes the person who is on the opposite side politically or whatever. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. That is a really strong requirement. We're required to have unity. I mean, just think about it. In the New Testament church, Jew, Greek, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, male, female, and they're all in one church. And they're all, according to Paul, in Christ, there's none of that.
Right.
So in Christ, we're one. You can have a slave master. We're going to get onto this in the next section of 1 Peter. You have slave master and a slave, but in the church, they're one.
Right.
Those distinctions don't exist. I mean, they exist in society, but somehow they could get on in the church and love one another. I mean, they must have had very different perspectives politically.
Of course.
Very different perspectives in terms of how they saw their duty civically. And yet in the church, obviously with great grace, they could get on. We should get on.
And I think you make a point about this is talking about a weaker and stronger conscience in a matter of a disputable matter can sometimes people adopt the mindset of I am settled, therefore I have a stronger conscience. Someone who disagrees with me has a weaker conscience, as opposed to two people can be settled in their minds and landing in different areas, and one person isn't more or less mature. There's just freedom to land in one or two different categories. So you might hear someone say, well, I do this kind of education for my kids, and this is me having a mature conscience. And the people who don't do that, they are weak brothers and sisters, and someday they will mature.
The other person seeing it from the opposite perspective.
Yeah, as opposed to saying, no, what you are to be is settled in your own mind. You're to have your conscience informed and to be settled biblically. And that means that there can be unity in Christ in the church by people who are doing things differently and not waiting for the other person to come around to their opinion, but settled that they might not do it the same way. And I think that's a little bit of a distinction that you might see with some of these issues down the road, where someone might say, well, I'm going to do it this way, I'm going to do it this way, based on their conscience.
Lloyd Jones did a good job, I thought, in expounding Romans 13 when he talked about the Christian and the state. So there's a whole load of lectures, Martin Lloyd Jones, Recording Trust, available. And he goes through the Christian's relation to the state. I disagree with him in some of his choices, but he addresses it all brilliantly historically. And he deals with the church and the state. He deals with the Christian and war. A very interesting take on that. But he would argue that, I mean, for over this issue, and it was a very live issue for him back in the day. Over the question of conscientious objection and pacifism, and he argues against pacifism, but he does argue for you would say the sanctity of the Christian conscience, that people have come to these positions, and we should never fall out within the church based on different conclusions over these kinds of issues. That they are complicated. If you listen to his lectures, you'll realize it's far more complicated. Yeah. There's also far more thought gone into this than most people realize. I was quoting from William Tyndale earlier. This is 1536. And what strikes me reading this book is he'd thought about all this way better than most modern commentators way back then. And there's been a lot of thought since then and critique of some of what he wrote and others and the reformers and the like. There's a ton of thought gone into it. Just war theory is another huge area that goes back not just centuries but millennia. Has been developed by the church, and so these questions are not new. The circumstances are new, and we need to face them anew. I think the peculiar thing for us to face is just this reality of the absence of trust. That's perhaps new for us.
It's interesting. I think one of the things that comes out from the series so far and from this discussion is that we have to be willing to think and to practice discernment and to work hard at deciding what we're going to do. And we naturally want someone to tell us what to do or what not to do. And even as Christians, the Bible's really clear. As you said, you must evaluate every command from the authorities. You're a slave of God. You have to actually think. And you commenting on all these conscience issues, you can't just pick someone's side and say, well, I like him, so I'm on his side, and therefore it's settled. That's not going to work when you're going into war to kill somebody. You need to know and you need to be settled.
I think the other thing we need to be settled on is that the answer is in the Scripture.
Yeah.
One of the things which has troubled me so much about the whole debate is time and again material I've read and interacted with has been primarily founded upon philosophy. So it's almost, if you look into the whole debate about the rightness or wrongness of the American rebellion, revolution, call it whichever you will,
right.
Very much of the argument is founded upon, well, this is reformed resistance theory.
Right.
Okay, get that. And this is natural law. Oh, really? So this is founded on principles we received from John Locke, the philosopher.
Right.
Okay, well, that's all very interesting, but tell me what the Bible said. And this is one of the areas Greg Fraser's done an awful lot of work, is investigating the sermons and the arguments of the preachers on both sides of the Revolutionary War, the patriots and the loyalists.
Right.
And he argues that the loyalist preachers actually had the more biblical arguments. But that's for him to argue and defend. Yeah. But I find it very painful to realize how much of the argument and how quickly people resort to philosophy.
Yeah.
One of my concerns about the spheres of authority, sphere sovereignty arguments is so much of it is grounded in authority. I think we can do a much better job grounding it in 1 Peter 2. I also think that, and I've said this earlier, but I'll say it again just in conclusion, I haven't yet found any examples where we need to go to philosophy or where we need to go to these theories in order to defend a course of action required of us as Christians.
Right.
I think every example I've seen so far, and I put this out as a challenge, I'd love to have concrete examples which require sphere sovereignty to actually know what to do right as a Christian. I'd love to have some concrete examples. I haven't found any. Every example I've seen actually can be taken care of by 1 Peter 2.
So are you saying the scriptures are sufficient?
I'm saying I think the scriptures are sufficient. And I'm saying I don't just think that. I'm resting on that, but I'm also saying I think when we go into this whole question of war and are dealing with conscientious objection or not, or how to respond if we're called upon to fight, given the uncertain, I'm saying I believe the scripture is sufficient for that too. I just don't yet see all the answers.
Yeah. Well, Tom, this has been really helpful. Thanks for letting me pick your brain. You've been prayerfully considering this for a long time.
This has been a wonderful and humbling study.
Praise the Lord. Well, church, we just want to remind you that this podcast is for you. This is something we're prayerfully each time before we start the episode. We're praying. We're asking that this will equip you, that this will help you, that this will help take what's happening in the pulpit and work it in, so to speak, into our lives. We want to be faithful. So we're praying this is useful. This is not the last word. We want to hear feedback, more questions that are raised. We are certain, as we've already said, there's more to discuss, but hopefully this is helping us as a church, because we want to be faithful. We want to take God's sufficient word and be transformed by it. And I think for me, the key takeaway is to be evangelistically submissive, to have an opportunity in this world to live as lights, as sojourners, so that God's gospel can be proclaimed throughout London and beyond. So,
amen to that.
That's it for this episode. We'll see you again soon, God willing.